Nancy Pearcey, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Are you ready for the Fast Five?
Okay, bring it on.
Here we go. First one, violin or fiddle?
Violin. I played the violin. Fiddle is quite different. The technique is quite different. The style is quite different. And I like it, but I'm a classically trained musician.
Okay, then Bach or Beethoven? That's not one of the questions, but I just want to know.
Bach. Absolutely. Bach. I actually don't like Beethoven very much. I like the early Beethoven, but not the later Beethoven. But Bach. A violinist should play a little bit of Bach every day. It just trains you. It just trains you in a way nothing else does.
So how did you go from violin to, well, we'll get back to that because I want to know how you went from violin into apologetics, but we're going to get back to that. So here's the second question. Francis Schaeffer or C.S. Lewis?
Oh, Schaeffer had a bigger influence on my life. And I'll tell you why. His form of apologetics spoke to me like no other apologetics did when I was a non-Christian. Schaeffer's form of apologetics has been called cultural apologetics because he looked at ideas as they percolate down through cultural forms like art and music and literature, movies. And I was a violinist, so I was very much attracted to somebody who could show how Christian truth related to the cultural world, to the arts. That was very attractive to me. So definitely I was more influenced by Schaeffer. Although after I discovered Schaeffer, I found out about Lewis. And of course, I teach a class on Lewis and Schaeffer because the two of them together, put them both, the best of both together. And that's how you learn apologetics.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, here we go. Because I read a little bit of your bio. I know you're in Houston. You teach at Houston Baptist University, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, you were married though in Apple Valley, Minnesota. So Houston, Texas, or Apple Valley, Minnesota?
Oh, Minnesota wins.
Why?
Minnesota's beautiful. I went to school in Minnesota, southern Minnesota for a while, and it was just gorgeous. The trees, the greenery, everything was beautiful. Houston is hot and humid. Okay, I mean, as far as a place to live, it's not really attractive, but Minnesota is beautiful.
Okay, that's good. That's great. Okay, how about this one? Now, you've spoken in front of thousands of people. What is the strangest experience you've ever had in your speaking career?
That is a hard one to answer. Let me change it from strange to special.
Okay. Here we go.
What was really special was I was invited to speak to the International CMDA, that's Christian Medical and Dental Association, and it was via Zoom. So via Zoom, these are Christian doctors all around the world, 50 some different countries, and I got a chance to address all of them on the issues in my book Love Thy Body. So that was just such a gift to be online and on the chat box. Chats were coming in from Nepal, and from Gambia and all kinds of places. So it was a unique experience.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Here we go. Final question. What is the oddest habit that your husband or sons say you have?
I live in my head. That's what my husband says. You live in your head. Because I'm always reading, always researching, always writing. I really live in the world of ideas. And but that's his favorite phrase. When he gets frustrated with the fact that I'm always in a book, he'll say, "You just live in your head." So that's the first thing that comes to mind.
No, that's great. That's great. Okay. So hearing all of this, saying you're married, and we talked just briefly, we hinted about Labri. You were trained classically as a violinist, but give us a bit of your story. Who is Nancy Pearcey, and how did you get to where you are today as an apologist and writer for the Christian faith?
Well, I was raised actually in a Christian home. It was a Lutheran home. My parents were both Scandinavian. So I don't know if you know that it's a little like all Scandinavians are Lutheran in the same way that all Irish are
Yes.
Catholic.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, what that meant was when I got to high school and started asking questions, nobody could answer them
Mm,
because they really weren't thinking that way. They weren't thinking in terms of apologetics. And I was attending a, public high school, so all my teachers are secular, all my textbooks are secular. In fact, I didn't have a single Christian friend in high
hmm,
school. I didn't know anyone who was Christian, and if they
mm,
were, they weren't telling you. This was in the 1970s, and some people tell me it was actually the late 60s, but some people tell me that was perhaps the time when America was the most secularized. We didn't have
mm,
things like Young Life and so on, for ministries for high school kids. At any rate, so I started just asking, how do we know Christianity is true? That was it. I just wanted to know, how do we know Christianity is true? And none of my parents or pastors could answer that question. I asked a Christian university professor, why are you a Christian? And he said, works for me. And I said, that's it, because it's not working for me anymore. And
mm,
I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, Lutheran, and I thought I'd get a more substantial answer. But all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as if
mm,
it was psychological phase that I was going
mm,
through. So eventually I decided Christianity must not have any answers, and I very intentionally set it aside. I decided it was up to me to find out what was true, that I would have to research all the religions and philosophies out there and decide for myself which one was true, which is a pretty big task for a 16-year-old. But I literally started walking down the hallway to the library in the public high school I attended and pulling books off the philosophy shelf because I thought, where else do people talk about this? Isn't that what philosophers are supposed to do, right? How do we know truth? And is there meaning to life? Is there purpose to life? Is there a foundation for ethics? And so on. And I pretty rapidly realized that if there was no God, then the answer to all of these questions was no, no, there is no purpose to life. There is no foundation for ethics. It's just, true for me, true for you. I realized there was even no foundation for knowledge because if all I have is my puny brain in the vast scope of time and history and space, how could I expect that I could know any sort of universal, objective, absolute truth? Ridiculous.
mhm,
It struck me as
mhm,
obviously ridiculous. So I became a total skeptic and relativist. I didn't have the words for it yet, but that's where I stood. And in fact, when I can remember a conversation I was having with a friend from school, and she was speaking about another person, and she said, "Oh, what she's doing is so wrong." And I said, "You can't say anybody's wrong.
mm,
There's no such thing as right or wrong." So by the time I went to Labri, which is a couple years later, I did end up at Labri, which is the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. And I was going to school in Europe because we had lived there when I was a kid. And
mm,
so I wanted to go back. And Labri is in Switzerland. So this was the first time I encountered any form of apologetics. I had no idea that Christianity could be defended with good reasons and arguments and logic and evidence.
mm,
I was blown away. I had never heard any of this. And of course, as I said earlier, in addition to that, Schaeffer was really good at. He was well known for supporting the arts. Right? So he was a place where they were artistically sensitive, as well as being intellectually challenging. And in addition, by the way, this was 1971, and all the students were hippies. So,
mm.
so this was back then. Hippies were the cool kids. So I just wondered, who are these Christians, because they're even able to reach across that cultural divide and connect with these disaffected young people. In fact, I was so impressed with Labrie that I left. I was
Mm,
after only a month, I left because I felt such pressure, internal pressure, not external, so much pressure to find out to figure out if this was true or not, and I needed to just get away in order to think about it. But because of my time at Labrie, I discovered apologetics. I continued reading Schaeffer. Os Guinness, I think, had come out with his first book by then. I discovered C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, and so just through my reading on my own, I decided I was intellectually convinced it was true. See, the reason I left is because I was afraid I might be drawn in emotionally because it was such an attractive version of Christianity. I'd never seen anything like it. And I didn't want to be drawn in emotionally. After all, Christianity had already let me down once before. And so I did not want to take that step unless I was absolutely convinced it was, intellectually that it was true. So I did come to that point, but I wasn't involved with a church or anything. So I thought, just on my own, I read my way back to God. And I thought, okay, this is cool, but where do I find other Christians now? I said, well, I knew some at Labri. So a year and a half later, I went back to Labri. And then that time I stayed 4 months and that's how I really got grounded in my understanding of Christian worldview. And so since that was such an important part of my own conversion, that became my life work, is to help other young people who are having the kind of questions that I had and help them to see that there really are good reasons for becoming a Christian. And it's not just a blind faith. It's not just, when I started having questions, Christians around me treated it as if it was a moral failing on my part, like something is wrong with you, that you don't have faith. Whereas Schaeffer used to say, we are obligated to give honest answers to honest questions. And so that's one of my guiding principles.
And then you met your husband there?
Yes. Yeah, I met my husband at Labri the second time I was there. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And he's from Germany, is that right?
He was born in Germany, of a German mom and an American soldier who abandoned her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he was a war orphan in a sense. So his mother put him in an orphanage. There was no way in post-war Germany with the economy in shambles that a single mom could survive. And so she was advised by her priest to put him up for adoption. So he did, and he was adopted by an American service couple. And so then they brought him back to the States when they came back.
And then you had two boys, and then just right after that, launched into the career. I mean, and you've done so many different things. Just reading through your biography, I got tired because it was going on so long and it was so extensive. And matter of fact, you got into a title that I'm pretty amazed at, where it says that you are America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. That's a lot of verbiage, and that's a heavy title. That's quite an honor.
You get tired just saying that, right?
Well, I want to know how you get that title. And is it possible for me to get the male version, or at least get it on a t-shirt, something like that? But it's a pretty honorific, amazing title. And I think it's well-deserved. Reading your books, and especially this book, Love Thy Body. And let's talk about that for a moment, because I read through the book and it's pretty phenomenal. And I want to
Before we go on, I just want
Sure.
you to say that title was in The Economist. It was not even in a Christian.
So it wasn't it wasn't one you came up with.
No. Was it an article? Yeah, that would be pretty funny if I came up with my own title. It was an article in The Economist. I mean, people have to. That's a well-respected secular journal. So
Yeah.
it was an article on, American evangelicalism, where they were trying to explain some things to the British audience, because The Economist is a British publication. So
Right.
So that's and the reporter quoted me, and then she's the one who gave me that title.
What did you think when you first saw that title? Like, oh no, or
I didn't know she was
that's
going to say
nice.
that. No, I had no idea.
Has your husband been like, does he ever call you that when he's mad? He gets frustrated with you? Oh,
No.
So, not at all. Not at all. And the kids remind you, right? Your sons remind you that, hey, that's not that. Mom, you might be that, but you're still mom to me.
Yes,
So,
the kids are totally unimpressed, let me tell you.
isn't that how it is? A prophet is without honor in his own house or her own house.
In her own kitchen.
Okay. So we have Love Thy Body, and it's a fantastic book. I've read the book, and I have underlining all over it. I've written notes everywhere. It's a phenomenal book, and I have to say, when I first saw it, I thought it was simply you were talking about transgenderism, and then when I got into it, I was surprised. I thought, well, wait a minute, she's starting with just the humanization and personhood and the body and the connection to it. But I really want to know, what was the impetus behind writing Love Thy Body?
Well, since we've talked about Labri, um, the impetus was the one of the main themes Francis Schaeffer uh, spoke about again and again was the division in the concept of truth. He
Mm,
noted that, in most cultures, people think that there's a natural order and a spiritual order, spiritual
mm,
slash moral order, but that they're integrated into a single cosmos, and therefore
mhm,
truth about them will be a integrated unity. Truth is an integrated unity. But in Western culture, after the rise of modern science, many people began to say, no, no, the only reliable knowledge we have is of science, empirical facts, what can be
mm,
tested in the laboratory. But what did that mean then for things that were not necessarily knowable directly by scientific methods, like morality and theology and even
mhm,
things like beauty, truth, goodness, and beauty?
mhm,
Um, in essence, truth was split apart so that Schaeffer used to use the metaphor of two stories in a building. So, in the lowest story is science and reason and testable truths. And in the upper story became a place where you toss things that you can't be known by purely scientific methods. And so that became sort of an attic where you would toss
mm,
things like religion and morality and theology. And so this was a split view of truth, and it was important for Schaeffer because it's the main reason, it's the main strategy that secularists use to discredit Christianity because they say, no, well, that belongs in the upper story. So that's just your personal preference. That's just what goes out of your experience. That's what helps you get through the night. And he had to help people to see. I mean, he's an apologist himself and an evangelist, and he had to help people see that that is the main barrier to communicating Christian truth today because people no longer have that view of truth. They don't have a biblical view of truth. They have this split view of truth. And so people unreflectively, you know, without even realizing that they're doing it, if you talk to them about Christian truth, they toss it in the upper story and think you're only talking about your personal preference, what's meaningful to you. They don't even hear it as an objective truth claim. And so you almost have to uh, take a two-step process. Schaeffer used to call it pre-evangelism. You almost have to. Well, I'll make it personal. When I went to Labri, I had to take this two-step process because I was such a relativist and skeptic. I had to first be persuaded that there was such a thing as objective truth before I could even consider whether Christianity was that objective truth. And that's the impact of this split view of truth. In secular academia, it's called the fact value split. And
mm,
Schaeffer didn't use that term, but in my earlier book, Total Truth, I said, hey guys, Schaeffer used this, little upper story, lower story metaphor. You know what he's talking about? He's talking about what we already know in secular academia as the fact value split. And then people said, oh, that's what he meant. So
mm.
today I often use that language because people connect with it better. The fact value split is more widely known. So people think Christianity's in the value realm, where it's really not a matter of true or false. It's a matter of what gives you a sense of purpose and meaning in your life, but it's completely subjective and relativistic.
Mm. So, taking that concept, then, what made you then want to put Love Thy Body and talk about the body specifically? Because when I hear today people talk that fact value split, and when people I talk to, even when you confront them with facts, they just say fake news. Whatever you want it to be, that's what it is. And that's your perspective. And how do you bring that out, especially as you're talking about thy body? Because you really do elaborate on this idea and concept as you developed. And I want to say you actually did it very masterfully, I thought, how you developed the book, even the pop culture references to break it up a bit. And in the subject matter that you took piece by piece, I thought was pretty understandable. It was digestible. And what I really loved is how you use stories of personal transformation to buttress the truth that you were presenting. But I've got ahead of myself. So let's go back here for a second and let's talk about the love thy body. Why this subject, and to really focus it on the body as you're talking about this fact value split? Because a lot of people, though that happens in academics, in everyday life, they don't always think that way, but they're doing it all the
They're
time.
doing it. Yeah. My
Yeah.
students, when I teach in my classroom, my students say, "This is the matrix." Isn't that good? This is the way people think, and they don't know that they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fact value split, and when it dawns on them, when they really realize how extensive it is, see, your view of truth is going to affect everything. And you know, so I wrote Total Truth on this split, trying to explain to Christians where it's coming from and what we need to do about it. And of course, the Christian version is the sacred secular split, so we have it too. Um, and then when I wrote Saving Leonardo, which is on the arts, lo and behold, I found the same split. I wasn't necessarily looking for it, but the first art history book I picked up said modern art has been split into two separate streams. And they called it, this was by Jacques Bazin, who's a well-known intellectual historian. And he called it the naturalist stream and the idealist stream. Well, obviously naturalism is the lower story, what we know as
Mm.
science, and idealism is, the upper story, the world of ideas. So right from the beginning, I realized that the upper lower story split applied to the arts as well. So then I decided I wanted to do morality.
Mm.
And I didn't go in expecting to find this split. But as soon as I started reading, I found out, yes, all of these moral issues are also influenced by a split between the body and the person.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the body is what we know by science and empirical research, but personhood is your value. So there's the fact
Mm.
value. Personhood is your moral status. It's whether we should give you legal protection. Let me, well, why don't we jump in with the transgender issue just because that's the easiest
Sure.
place to see it
Yeah.
today, and everybody knows about it today. So transgenderism basically is, as transgender activists themselves say, they say that your gender identity has nothing to do with your biological sex, that your
Mm.
body is not part of the authentic self. A BBC documentary put it this way: at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body.
Mm.
So that's an incredible statement of internal alienation. In fact, some transgender activists now say the term biological sex is a hate term because it reminds them that there is such a thing as biology. Um,
Mm.
and I read a book by a philosopher. I think it's the first book on a philosophical level defending transgenderism by a Princeton University professor, because what the academics say is what eventually filters down. So I wanted to see what she would say. And the interesting thing, first of all, is that she acknowledged that transgenderism involves self-alienation, self-division. That there's a sharp divide between who you feel you are, mentally, and what your biological sex is. But then she concluded that your biological sex doesn't matter. She literally said the real body, meaning the physical body, the real body tells us nothing. It has nothing to do with who we are. So, what Christians should be responding is, why should we accept such a demeaning view of the body? Christianity says your body has great value and dignity as the handiwork of God. And even it's what's fascinating is that even secular people are starting to recognize that this is the issue. I read an interview with a 14-year-old girl who had lived as a trans boy for 3 years, from age 11, and then at age 14 recovered her identity as a girl. And
Mm.
she said, the turning point came, and this is a direct quote, She said, the turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body.
Mm.
And the interview came out after my book was already published, but it would have been a great quote
Yeah.
for a book titled Love Thy Body.
Mm.
And it was on a very secular liberal website. So that means
Mm.
even secular people are starting to see. You'll see this phrase sometimes these days. Um, Transgenderism is body hatred. Body hatred. So they're starting to recognize that the issue here is your view of the body, is your
Mm.
negative view of the body is really at the heart of all of these moral issues that we're up against today.
And you really do draw that out, and you mentioned that the psychological man, I think that's what Truman calls it when he talks about the change between the religious man and the psychological man, and finding one's identity and becoming what the authentic self. And you really draw that out in kind of layman's terms, which I thought was phenomenal. And one of the things that I really loved what you did was you talked about how when that is drawn out, or the transgenderism, or with homosexuality, for example, you mentioned how people say it's courageous to come out and declare this, but at the same time, when they go back, it's not considered courageous. And it seems like people are swallowing this lie of this, as you mentioned, the Cartesian dualism, if you will. How do we then address that with people that are in our families and our friends? Because I know in my daughter, I have four children, and one of them is a going to be a sophomore in high school, and she is already dealing with this with her friends. And
Mm.
I'd say almost one third of her friends are choosing, it's the popular thing to be bi, or how could you be against it, and or poly or pan, or whatever it is. And I'm not sure if many of them even know what that is. But how do we then address this with our family and friends? Because I have not just my daughter facing that, I've got on both sides of my family young people that are in this world, that it's just being brought to them all the time. And I think your goal, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's to really shine a light on it, to say, this is not fixed. This is a lie we've been told. And let's get back to the biblical view of the body. For when we do, we're going to really see how God has made us. But I mean, what do you say to that? How do you help people to see that?
Well, just to focus on a particular issue, let's go to homosexuality. Um,
Okay,
because
let's do it.
even my homosexual friends
Hmm.
acknowledge that on the level of biology, anatomy, physiology, chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. That's
Hmm.
how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed.
Hmm.
To embrace a same sex identity, therefore, is to reject that design. It's to implicitly say, why should my body have any say in who I am? Why should my biological sex influence my moral decisions? And what we have to help people to realize is that is a very disrespectful view of the body.
Mm.
And so the logic there is, if my body is not part of who I am, why should I let it determine my moral choices? There's a well-known public intellectual, I'm sure you know, named Camille Paglia. Camille
Mm.
Paglia is
Hmm.
a lesbian. By the way, she's now claiming to be transgender, but for many years she's been a lesbian feminist. And what the reason a lot of conservatives read her is because she's a bit of an iconoclast. She does not accept the feminist view that sex is just a social construction. She says, no, no,
Mm.
no. Nature made us male and female. Humans are a sexually reproducing species.
Mm.
So then you say, well, how do you justify being a lesbian then? And here's what she says. She uses this exact word. She says, why not defy nature?
Mm.
And then she goes on to say, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So do you catch the logic there? If our bodies are products of mindless, purposeless forces, then they have no intrinsic purpose that we're morally obligated to respect. They tell us nothing about who we are, and the mind can do with the body whatever it wants. It's perfect. That is perfectly logical from that perspective. In other words, If our bodies are products of material forces, then what dignity do they really have? They're just products of natural selection. And actually, this is where I push people back when you say, how do you deal with them? First, I deal with having respect for your body, and then I help them to see the underpinnings of that. Your view of morality always rests on your view of nature. Um, if if it is true, like Camille Paglia says, that our bodies are products of mindless, purposeless forces, then it makes perfect sense to say, do with it what you want. It's just a natural resource, like any other natural resource, and we can exploit it and use it, for our own purposes. There is no divine purpose that we're supposed to respect. The Christian viewpoint is teleological. In other words, there's a purpose. It comes from the word telos, right? Which means purpose. And it says that, in fact, we are made for a purpose, and science shows us that we're made for a purpose, that uh, living things, living structures are made for a purpose. Eyes are made for seeing, and ears are made for hearing. That wings are made for flying, fins are made for swimming. In fact, the development of the entire organism is directed by an inbuilt plan or blueprint. So science itself tells us that living things are made for a purpose. And what Christians are saying is that when we live in accord with that purpose, we will ultimately be happier and healthier.
So, taking that, how we will be happier and healthier, even though you mentioned how Christians are much more satisfied, whether it's in marriage, in the sexual sphere, monogamous, conservative, middle age, have the best sex lives. You actually bring that out, and I thought that was pretty impressive, especially because I'm in the middle of all that line, so it made me feel pretty good right there. But um, when you address these issues, and you really are, you're developing this case for the body, and the way you start, you talk about abortion and how people separate it between not even, you mean the name, the nomenclature that's being used and the titles, and how it can be a human but not a person. And again, it's that bifurcated understanding of things, and that's how people are saying it. There's a separation everywhere we go. Matter of fact, you develop it well, where we see that separation. How do we get people to see that they are integrated, and it's not one or the other, but it's both together?
Well, let me go into a little more detail on abortion, because that's where it started. When I first started
Yeah.
researching this subject, I saw it first in abortion, because most people don't realize this, but professional bioethicists all agree that life begins at conception. Your next door neighbor may not be there yet, but professional bioethicists, the evidence from science, from DNA and genetics, is just too strong to deny it. So, how do they get around that in order to support abortion? What they say is the fetus can be biologically human, genetically human, chromosomally human at some point, but it doesn't become a person until sometime later. So, if you can be human at one point, but not a person until sometime later, then clearly these are two separate things. And personhood is usually defined in terms of mental abilities, some level of cognitive functioning, self-awareness, and so on. And so you can easily see this is again Schaeffer's upper story, lower story divide. So in the lower story, what we know by science, the human fetus is clearly human. But when we talk about personhood, we're talking about the value that we put on human life. What moral status does it have? Is it deserving of legal protection? So see, it is again the fact value split. And what we have to help people to see is, um, like you said, we can't split it that way. You have to make detailed arguments that um, the fetus is human from the beginning. Every human is a person. If you allow them to be separated out like that, then, as everybody knows, once you allow being human, being human is no longer enough for human rights. Basically, is what
Mm-hmm.
is what
Mm-hmm.
bioethicists are saying. In other words, they'll acknowledge the fetus is human, but they'll say nonetheless, you can kill it for any reason or no reason. You can tinker with it genetically. You can do research and experiments on it. You can pick through it for sellable body parts, like Planned Parenthood does, and then toss it out with the other medical waste. And that is exactly
Mm,
how medical journals refer to it, as medical waste. So the upshot is being human is no longer enough for human rights. And
mm,
that's what people need to understand. Is because once you make that distinction, then, according to the Supreme Court, if we took it absolutely logically, you and I do not have human rights. We don't have human
mm,
rights unless the government tells us we do. We used to think human rights, you and I had human rights just by the sheer fact of being part of the human race. That was enough. Once you're human, you're in, you count. But when the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade made the distinction between human and person, it essentially now says you don't have human rights until the government says you're a person. So we've seen where that goes. We've seen that in other places like Nazi Germany, where that goes. If certain people can be pronounced as non-human or less than human, it opens up the door to incredible inhumanity and tyranny. And euthanasia, by the way, is the same argument, just in reverse, right? So in euthanasia, the argument is if you lose a certain level of cognitive functioning, if you lose a certain level of self-awareness, then you are no longer a person. And at that point, as one bioethicist I read put it this way, you're just a body, just a body. And as a result, your treatment can be withheld, your organs can be harvested, food and water can be discontinued. So once again, being human is no longer enough for human rights. So that's what we're facing today, and that's what people have to realize. The consequence of making this distinction is we've lost the notion of human rights.
mm. And you mentioned that this is a product of secular liberalism, and that's the kind of the culture of itself. And you even cite this reference where a young girl that you encounter says that we can't impose our views on other people. And you said, "What is secularism doing? It's imposing, its view on other people." And I want to talk about secularism just for a moment because I interviewed and I had a conversation with Philip Jenkins in his book Fertility and Faith. And in the book, he talks about how secularism has been exported around the world. I mean, the globalist idea, globalist understanding of things. And in it, he documents the birth rates across the world, that what happens when secularism comes into a culture, no matter what the culture, the birth rates plummet. And I believe he cites Uganda as having the highest birth rate and Germany having the lowest. And you see, he goes, what happens is you're starting to see is when secularism comes in, not only do the birth rates go down, but other sexual issues go up, whether it's homosexuality, transgenderism. There's a great deal of confusion. And yet, in many ways, I mean, secularism is a product, and you might agree, you may not, of modernity as it's coming in and all these different processes. But we, in sharing and exporting the mission of Christ to the world, we've done really well, or we think we do well. And I'm talking about evangelicalism in the West, of sharing the gospel, but in doing so in ways that we can see measured results pretty quickly, whether it's giving water, whether it's giving food, whether it's giving help, that kind of thing. But yet, and I've shared this kind of ad nauseum, but we don't talk about reaching Japan. And it's one of the most secular cultures in the world. How do we separate secularism and recognize it for what it is and separate it even from the Christian faith? And I say secularism using it as a synonym for modernity. Can we do that? And or are we stuck with it and we just have to learn to develop the language of sharing people that are trapped in it and showing them a proper theology of the body?
Since I became a Christian through apologetics, of course, I'm very big on actually using apologetics in evangelism. Addressing the culture, addressing its beliefs, and finding ways to help people to see that they're wrong, that those beliefs are inadequate, that they're not good enough, they're not adequate to describe reality as we know it. And that is um, what Schaeffer did so what Schaeffer did so well was he got inside of other worldviews, belief systems, and showed from within why they were not adequate to explain reality. And just as an example, if you're a moral relativist, um, you can show pretty quickly with most people that they don't actually live by their own moral relativism. They all do have moral convictions. There are things that they think are absolutely, truly wrong. All you have to ask them is there one thing you can think of that you think is really wrong? and they will think of them very quickly.
Mm,
So that's a way of sort of, instead of saying, well, the Bible says, you actually got inside their own relativism and showed that it doesn't work. It doesn't match their own behavior. And
mm,
so that's a very simple example, but that's essentially what Schaeffer did, is show that you can't just preach Christianity at people. You have to first help them to see that their own worldview is inadequate. And that's really how, that's how Labri, that's what I learned at Labri. They quickly showed me that the various
mm,
isms that I was holding, were not adequate. You have to show that before they're willing to consider an alternative. Otherwise the traditional evangelistic method was trying to show people their need in terms of sin and
mm,
conviction. But you can also show need by showing them that their own worldview doesn't answer the questions of reality. That
mm.
that they themselves cannot live within their own worldview, so that their own worldview cannot be an adequate description of reality. So I'm really big on doing apologetics as a way of reaching out to people and helping them to see that their own worldview doesn't work, even for themselves. But I would say, um, I don't use the word modernity necessarily,
Okay.
because you yourself mentioned a moment ago that a lot of people today don't care about facts.
Right. Right.
They're postmodern.
Yeah.
They're postmodern. Um, and especially with these moral issues that I address in Love Thy Body, the secular views are all completely postmodern.
Mm,
And that's one reason that Christians have had a hard time dealing with them, because we're not as familiar with postmodernism. Most of our apologetics is geared toward the modern mind. Okay, so they're addressing materialism and
mhm,
scientism and naturalism and even empiricism. Most of our apologetics is geared toward that form. That's modernity. Okay, that's the lower story. Those are the isms that are trying to be scientific. They all were initially inspired, and if you look at them historically, they were all initially inspired by the scientific revolution, and they all said, okay, science gives us the ultimate truth. Let's figure out what are the philosophical implications of that. So you can see that with materialism, naturalism, that they're obviously trying to say, the material world is all that exists, and we know it through science. And most of our apologetics has dealt just with the lower story, with those isms. But we've ignored the upper story. The upper story has isms like, I mentioned idealism a moment ago, philosophical idealism, which was, everything's in your mind, existentialism, and now postmodernism. These are all in the upper story. And there's a label for these, by the way. The lower story is called the analytic tradition. If you've taken philosophy, you might know these: analytic tradition and the continental tradition. And most of our apologists have not been dealing with the continental tradition, but it is what has permeated English, the humanities,
mhm,
political science, the social sciences. The university today is kind of split between the natural sciences, which is still stuck in modernity, and that's important because science is still very influential in our lives today. So they're stuck in modernity, but the other half of the campus, the humanities and the social sciences, are completely taken over by postmodernism. So when you talked about, how do we craft our message, the Christian message for different audiences? That split is one of the most important splits that we need to address. We have to show that Christian truth is rich enough and multidimensional enough that it can answer questions from any of these perspectives.
mm. And I think you've hit what I was trying to say in many ways, is just that secularism is there, but you're saying be within that culture and answer and make the culture face its own, like a mirror, putting a mirror up to show that it's not sustainable for a cognitive framework in order to live. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, if you want to pursue this is the whole theme of my book, Finding Truth. By
Okay.
the way, is taking secular ideas and show how they collapse from within. And I researched this book for a long time because I wanted to find secular people admitting it, and I
Mm,
did. I found several people. This was astonishing. several people who said they were scientists and philosophers and well-known ones, prominent people, um, who basically said, I'm a materialist. I believe that humans are basically complex biochemical machines, but does anyone really live like a machine? I'll give you one or
Mm,
two examples. Um, Marvin Minsky, who used to be at MIT. I think he's retired now, but anyway, MIT. So not a fringe character. He wrote a book called uh, he wrote a book in which he argued. Um, he was most famous for his phrase, the human brain is just a 3 pound computer made of meat. And he said, we're just basically biochemical machines. There's no such thing. Because we're computers, we don't have free will. My computers don't have free will. And so neither do we. And then he says, um, but we cannot give that concept of, we cannot give up the concept of free will because all of our understandings of the mental world is based on the notion of free will. And here's his direct quote: we cannot ever give this up, this concept. We cannot ever give it up, even though we know it's false. In other words, according to his materialistic worldview, there is no free will, there is no mental life. There's just neurons firing in the brain. But we can't give it up in practice, even though we know it's false. And this is an incredible cognitive dissonance. And in my book Finding Truth, I show that every secular, well, and non-Christian, but I deal mostly with secular worldviews, um, have lead to cognitive dissonance, and that's what you can use in evangelism. That you can
mm,
help them to see that their own worldview doesn't fit the facts.
mm,
Here's the example that my students always remember the most. Um, this is Rodney Brooks, also MIT. He was the head of the artificial intelligence lab there. And he
mm,
wrote a book called Flesh and Machines. And in that book, once again, he says, we're just biochemical machines, we're robots. And by the way, when they say no free will, I used to think, well, that's just one feature of human beings. Why
mm,
do, there's a lot of other ones. But it turns out that they talk a lot about free will because it's the foundation of all the other human, distinctively human features. Like, think what you couldn't do if you didn't have free will. You couldn't love, right? Because robots don't love. You couldn't do any sort of creativity or arts. What else? You couldn't even think rationally because you'd be programmed to think a certain way, so it wouldn't be a rational choice. And so free will has become sort of the touchstone for all of these distinctively human traits. So here's Rodney Brooks saying we don't have free will, we're just machines. And then he says, I know most people, it's hard to see people as
mm.
just machines. But when I look at my children, when I force myself, I can see that they are machines. And then he says, is that how I treat them? Of course not. They have my unconditional love, which he then says is totally irrational within my worldview. And so you wonder, how does he fit these two together then? He ends the paragraph by saying he doesn't even try. He says, I maintain two sets of contradictory beliefs. So I found several examples like that of people saying, I'm a naturalist, I'm a materialist, but you know what? I can't actually live with my beliefs. I can't function on the basis of my own worldview. So that's wonderful examples that we can use in evangelism as we learn then to, from these examples, we can learn how to do it with other worldviews as well, of course. We can help people see, pinpoint where the cognitive dissonance is, pinpoint where they cannot live within their own worldview. And then that shows them that their own worldview isn't big enough. It's not big enough to encounter even their own experience. We don't have to tell them, be open to the Christian worldview, be open to the existence of God. We can say, look at your own experience. Your worldview doesn't even explain your own experience of reality. And so that is very powerful.
It is extremely powerful. And is that really what you hope to accomplish with the book as you're addressing these issues, helping people to see that their worldview is not compatible and actually the biblical worldview brings a cognitive, I mean, you said cognitive dissonance, but it's the opposite way. It's coherence. Is that what you hope to accomplish by helping people see that? And you provide story after story of people that were changed, or they came out of homosexuality. They actually leave the gender that they chose to be. They go back to the gender that they were assigned at birth. I mean, you even bring in intersex. You hit so many different things. But is that what you hope to do? Is to show the harmony of the Christian worldview and where there's hope and peace in the middle of all that?
Yes, let me pause by saying I would not say assigned at birth.
Okay. Okay. Sorry.
Who controls the language, controls the
Yeah, that's
output.
right. You're right. You're right.
You know,
So what would you say?
observed,
What would you say?
observed at birth. I,
Observed at birth.
it's a scientific fact that is observed. And by the way, it's usually before birth. Most people have an ultrasound.
Right.
But yeah, it's
Okay.
a scientific fact that's actually observed. Yeah, well,
Okay.
in Love Thy Body, it's a little bit a different form of apologetics because people are no longer asking, is Christianity true? They're
Hmm.
asking, why are Christians such bigots?
Yes. Yes.
So, in Love Thy Body, my main goal is to show that the Christian ethic actually is very life affirming and has a high view of the body and gives value and dignity to the body much more than the secular view does. And since you mentioned stories, let me give you one or two.
Mm.
There's a young woman named Jean who lived as a lesbian for many years and became a Christian and uh, and now is married and has two children. And here's how she expressed the change. She said, I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason,
Mm.
and I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. So,
Mm.
a lot of what I do in Love Their Body is teach Christians how to use that positive language, trusting God, um, honor my body, living in accord with the Creator's design, respecting my biological sex, live in harmony with my body, with who
Mm.
I am. I'm, I think for Christians, we have to start just by changing our language so that we're
Mm.
focusing on the positive. And the other story that really brings this out well is Sean Doherty, who
Mm.
was exclusively attracted to other men growing up. And what's interesting about his story is that he grew up in a quote gay affirming family and
Mm.
attended a quote gay affirming church. So he didn't think there was anything wrong with homosexuality. He was not driven by shame or guilt. Most people think that homosexuals, have shame and guilt piled on them. But that wasn't the case in his for him. And today he's married and has three kids. By the way, married to a woman. You have to say that these days. Um, so what changed for him? He said, I came, here's how he put it, I stopped basing my sexual identity on my feelings and I started basing my identity on my body. After all, feelings can change and often do, but my body doesn't. It's a empirical fact that does not change. And he said, I decided, and here's how he put it, I decided to accept my body as a good gift from God. And that's really the worldview issue at the heart of this debate. Do we live in a cosmos operating by blind material forces, in which case our body has no intrinsic dignity or value, it's just kicked up out of the slime by random forces? Or do we live in a cosmos created by a loving creator, in which case our bodies are intrinsically good? They are a good gift from God. And see that positive language? We want to persuade
Mm.
people that their body is a good gift and that they should be
Mm.
honoring their own bodies. That's the message that will reach home. We it's not we're known for having a negative message, right? Christians are known for saying it's wrong, it's a sin, it's against the Bible, don't do it, and there's something wrong with you. That's kind of
Mm.
what we're known for. And so Love Thy Body is retraining people to say you are valuable in God's sight and your body is a good gift from God, and we are calling you to live in harmony with your body, to respect your biological sex. It's a completely different message.
Mm. What do you hope to accomplish with the book? I mean, really bring home, like, what's the best case scenario? You say, God, I would be so honored if you did this with your book.
Bring people to God. Bring people to God. You know,
Mm.
The point is not to get you to change your sexuality. That's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to help people to say, oh, this Christian worldview is really attractive. It
Mm,
has a much higher view of the body. I'll tell you what, some people have misunderstood. Without naming names, there was a Christian philosopher who reviewed the book. He hadn't actually read it. He just read some notes from his producer.
mm.
So we'll give him a break. But he said, Nancy's wrong when she says that materialism has a lower view of the body, because materialists think the body is all that exists, the physical world, right, is all that exists. And so they have actually a too exalted view of the body. To which I say, no, if you think the body is a product of mindless, purposeless, random forces, you do not have a high view of the body. It's
Mm,
just because you think it's all that exists doesn't mean you have a high view of it. It's Christianity that has a high view of the body. And so my goal ultimately is to draw people into seeing the beauty of the Christian worldview and being drawn ultimately to a relationship with God. So it's ultimately about evangelism. Ultimately, I have to make this point sometimes with my Christian friends, like, this, especially if a family member is having a problem with transgenderism or sexual identity. They're so focused on changing their views on the sexual issues. And I have to say, okay, what's our ultimate goal here? You know, the ultimate goal is to win people's hearts to God.
that's a good word. And what do you see as the biggest challenges for doing that with the younger generation? I mean, you're a professor, you're teaching Christian young people all the time, and you're encountering worldviews. What do you see as the biggest challenge in sharing this with them today?
Oh, mostly that they've been so indoctrinated by the media. I had one student say, well, yeah, of course I'm a Christian, but. And then she just
Mm,
spouted all the stuff she'd gotten from the secular media, word for word. It's like they've been programmed. So
mm,
sometimes it's hard to get a foot in the door. You know, they she finally listened to me to some
hmm,
degree, but just hearing, they're so close to the Christian, even like I said, this Christian woman, young woman, student, um, was so close to the Christian view because she had only heard it presented in a very negative way. And it was very
mm,
hard for her to even open her mind to the idea that there's a different way to express the Christian ethic than the way she'd always heard it. However, once they do hear it, and of course not all my students are that way. Many of them are very really seeking. It's a Christian university, so they're seeking to be biblical in their view. But even for them, I have to tell you, they say, I just never heard it presented this way. I, and I have to tell you, people are for using the book for things other than the sexual issues. One of my graduate students had a teenage daughter who had a very severe eating disorder. She'd had to be hospitalized even,
mm,
and she was taking her 13-year-old daughter through Love Thy Body, sentence by sentence, to help her to
mm,
realize that God wants her to value her body. And she said to me, I I wasn't helping her because I didn't have a high view of the body. Here's how one of my students put it. Growing up in the church, I was always taught spirit good, body bad. And when I say that, I use that in my lectures now, and invariably the whole audience says, "Uh-huh." Yep, that's pretty much the message we picked up too. And so this mother found out that she'd been communicating that to her daughter, and that she was not communicating to her daughter that she should value her body as a good gift from God. So she was using it for an eating disorder. Other people have contacted me, and a woman who had been sexually abused and who therefore, rejected her body, felt alienated from her body. She was using Love Thy Body. A woman who was obese and had difficulty with her body image. Um, and even a woman with rheumatoid arthritis contacted me, and she said, I was, I was reconciling myself to my, this condition, this medical condition, by saying, "Well, I am not my body."
mm,
And she said, oh, I read your book. And I realized, I don't know if you remember, but in my book, I give the example of a transsexual, a
Hmm.
man, male to female transsexual, who was raising money on a fundraising on the Kickstarter. She was raising money for a documentary, which was titled "I Am Not My Body."
Yes, I remember
Do you
that.
remember that? So, so, so my friend with rheumatoid arthritis realized that she had basically picked up the secular view that was being used by transsexuals to alienate themselves, to separate themselves from their body. Here's one more thing that I do with with Christians. I help them to realize that they have lost their own heritage. That if
Mm,
you go back to the early church, they faced the same denigration of the physical world that we face, but for very different reasons. The early church faced isms like Gnosticism. Right? Some of the New
hmm
Testament is actually written against Gnosticism, Platonism, Manichaeism. Augustine was a Manichae for a while. And all of these isms denigrated the material world as the realm of death, decay, and destruction. And Gnosticism even taught that there were several different levels of deities, of gods, and that it was the lowest level deity, an evil god, who had created this world because no self respecting god would get his hands dirty mucking about with matter. Um, and the goal of salvation was to escape from the physical world and reascend up into the ether, into the non material
hmm
realm. In this context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary because it said, for starters, the world was not created by an evil God, it was created by the supreme God who is a good God. And therefore, his handiwork is good. And that's not obliterated by the fall. The fall is like taking a beautiful masterpiece and scribbling some magic marker on it, but you can still see the beauty shining through. And that's what we have to insist with that the Christian worldview says you can still see the beauty of God's handiwork and the goodness of God's handiwork shining through. But was the greatest scandal at the time, historically, was the doctrine of the incarnation, the idea that that supreme deity had actually entered into the material world and taken on a physical body. Um, the incarnation is the ultimate affirmation of the dignity of the human body. And then when Jesus was executed on a Roman cross, he did escape the physical realm, as Gnosticism taught we should aspire to do. But what did he do then? He came back in a
Yeah.
physical body. To the ancient Greeks, this was not spiritual progress. This was regress.
Mm.
Um, what they said at the time, in fact, was who would want to come back to the realm of the body? So the bodily resurrection affirms the dignity of the human body. And then at the end of time, what is God going to do? He's not going to scrap the material world as if he made a mistake the first time around. He's going to renew it and
Mm.
restore it, creating a new heavens and a new earth. So from the very beginning, the Apostles' Creed has affirmed the resurrection of the body. This is an amazingly high view of the material world.
Mm.
There's nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy. And that's what we should be communicating to people. We should be so on fire, so excited, so grateful, so full of joy that we have such a wonderful message that it should just be, that should be the tone that we approach other people with.
Mm. Of excitement and joy and an understanding of the body. But you also mentioned that a lot of these students agreed with you. Spirit good, body bad, which means our churches aren't teaching this idea. How do we help our churches see the need to recover a proper theology of the body?
Now, that is a very good question because one of the things I hear again from students, especially graduate students who are older and who've tried to work within their churches, one of the things I hear most frequently is my pastors are not behind this. They'll sometimes agree for me to teach a class, but even then, they sometimes don't even agree to teach the class. I had one of my graduate students was a in charge of the women's ministry at a fairly large church here in Houston, and she wanted to teach my book, Love Thy Body. She had a uphill battle. It's like, oh no, those are controversial issues. We don't want to touch those. She gradually won. She's a persistent person, but or another case was I visited with a friend. I visited a Lutheran church here in Houston, and my friend was introducing me to the pastor, and he said, "Oh, you probably have her book Total Truth on your on your bookshelf somewhere." And he looked at her and said, "No, I don't read apologetics." um, so one of the most important things is one of those maybe the other side, the positive side is my books are being taught in many seminaries, so that future pastors, I do hear from seminarians a lot who are reading my books. So we may see some movement in the future, but Travis, the most important thing is when somebody in their own family
Mm.
uh, is having difficulties. One of my graduate students, the reason he was in my class is because his daughter had announced to him that she was a lesbian, that she was attracted to
Mm.
other girls. And so he came to my class, and for his final project, he wrote a curriculum. He wrote a curriculum that can be used in churches based on
Mm.
Love Thy Body and the other readings in the class. And his he submitted it to his church, and they agreed to run it to run a class.
Mm.
Um,
That's awesome.
and one of the pastors was a former seminary dean, so he had a pretty high bar to cross.
Mm.
But in terms of the quality, he had to be
Yeah.
good quality, and so that's what is turning most people around is when somebody in their own family has an issue. Um, in fact, speaking of which, let me give you one more story,
Yeah. No, I love this.
a
So
transgender
encouraging.
story. Um, so one of the longest anecdotes I tell in Love Thy Body is a young boy who had gender dysphoria from a very young age. Gender dysphoria, true gender dysphoria, usually does start very young. Um, before he was even walking, I call him Brandon, not his real name.
Mm.
Before he was even walking, his babysitter said to his mom, "He's too good to be a boy," by
Mm.
which she meant he was sweet and gentle and compliant and the things that we normally associate with girls. In preschool, when his mother picked him up, invariably he was playing with the little girls and not the little boys. By elementary school, he was coming to his parents frequently, weeping and saying, "I think the way girls do. I'm interested in the things girls are. God should have made me a girl." And this lasted for years. This was very, it was, this is a difficult, true gender dysphoria is a very intractable issue. And by age 14, he was scouring the internet for information on sex reassignment surgery. So, what did his parents do? First of all, they made sure he knew they loved him just the way he was. A lot of parents try to push their child into more gender conforming behavior. I had a friend when I was in seminary who was a former homosexual. He said, when I was young, I liked music and poetry, and my father was baffled and kept trying to toughen me up by
Mm.
pushing me into more traditional masculine things like sports. So Brandon's parents didn't do that. They said it's perfectly okay for you to be a gentle, sweet, sensitive, relational boy. It does
Right.
not mean you're really a girl. And of course, by the same token, it's perfectly okay for a girl to be gender nonconforming, to be more assertive and rational, take charge. They even took him through personality tests like the Myers-Briggs test, which
Mm.
show that you could be a male at either side of the spectrum, or you can be a female on either side of the spectrum, and that he doesn't have to have his life ruled by stereotypes.
Mm.
The John Wayne masculinity stereotype. In fact, one of their favorite phrases was this: It's not you that's wrong. It's the stereotypes that are wrong.
Mm.
They said it over and over. They even took him through, by the way, my book Total Truth has a chapter on the history of concepts of masculinity and femininity. And they took him through that and said, look, concepts of masculinity change. They're historically contingent. You do
Mm.
not have to let them rule your life. Just because all
Mm.
your friends think this way doesn't mean that this is a biblical masculinity. So and I should say it took a long time, but last time I talked to him, he had in fact embraced his identity as male. He was about 20. He was in his early 20s, and here's how he put it. He said, "I finally realized that even surgery would not give me what I wanted. It would not make me a girl,"
Mm.
which
Mm.
is absolutely true, biologically speaking. There's a famous TED talk by a cardiologist, and the most famous line from the TED talk is, um, "Every cell has a sex. Every cell in your body is different, based on whether you're male or female." She's a cardiologist, and so her concern was that symptoms of an impending heart attack are different for men and women. And doctors were being trained just to see the male symptoms, and so women were not being treated, and they were having heart attacks. So that was her goal. But her point was, you know, every cell, including your heart cells, every cell of your body has a sex, and obviously you can't change every cell of your body. So truly, it is truly biologically accurate to say even surgery won't give you what you want. So that was something that we can be on the lookout in our families, in our churches, is for these gender nonconforming kids, because they are being targeted big time by transgender activists who are telling them, if you don't fit these stereotypes, you're really the opposite sex. And kids are young enough that they have no defenses against that. There was a news story not long ago about a first grader came home from school and said, my teacher told me that, just because you have girl parts doesn't mean you're a girl. Just because you have boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy. So she said, Mommy, what am I? And she literally said, please take me to a doctor so we can find out what I am. And the reason it was in the news is because the parents were taking the school to court for emotional distress for their child.
Mm.
But kids down to first grade and even kindergarten now are being taught the transgender ideology, and we really need to fight for these kids. As parents,
Mm.
as in the church, we need to fight for them, especially the more gender nonconforming, because they are being targeted.
How do we, as time goes on, and we're going to see this, as you mentioned before, even secularists are realizing that the worldview is bankrupt. But that takes time, as you mentioned again with Schaeffer. It's a trickle down effect, and it's going to take time to get to the schools and the courts and everything else. How do we hold on to hope that it's going to be shown to be bankrupt, and how soon do you think that will be before that really catches on?
Yeah. I'll give you good news and bad news. Okay, the bad news is um, the Supreme Court has now basically come out on the side of transgenderism. This was what? Let me pull up my notes here. This was what, last June, I think. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
last June. Um, the Bostock decision
Mm.
basically said, it's now in the Supreme Court, that if you identify as a woman, no matter what your biological sex is, you must be treated as a woman in the workplace. So, woman is no longer a biological fact, it's a mental state. On the level of the Supreme Court now, we have a decision. Basically, this is not a question of law, it's a question of philosophy. And yet they've taken the stance that to be a woman or a man is not an issue of biology, it's a matter of your mental state. And so as a result, so that's the bad news, is that we now have a transgender decision on the level of the Supreme Court. The good news is the British Supreme Court, they call it the High Court, but it's the equivalent of their Supreme Court, has come out with a decision going the other direction. there's a young woman named Kyra Bell, Keira Bell, Kyra Bell, who went to the largest gender clinic in England called the Tavistock. She was, I don't remember, maybe about 16. Um, and and they just fast tracked her into transitioning, which is pretty common for gender clinics today. If you're a parent and you have a kid who's wondering, do not about their gender identity, do not send them to a gender clinic. The gender clinics
Mm,
today are all completely activist. I had a chance to interview parents for an article I
mm,
wrote for the Federalist. It was really eye opening because I heard parent after parent tell me, when it was happening to them, they did not know yet that you don't take your kid to a gender clinic. They thought, of
mm,
course, that's where you would go. That's where you get expert opinion. And they really thought that the gender clinic would support the parent in saying, no, no, you need to wait. Let's find out if you have any underlying issues. Psychological issues may be playing a role here. A study was done not long ago by Brown University professors finding that 63% of girls, this was just girls, who claim a transgender identity, 63% had other psychological mental health issues before their gender dysphoria started.
mm.
So self-harming, uh, autism is the most common, anxiety, depression, OCD, etc. So these are very troubled kids. That's what we need to realize too. I mean, in the church, when we deal with these issues, these are very troubled kids, and we need to treat them very gently. Um, but all that background to say that Kyra Bell and the British High Court, she was fast tracked into transitioning, puberty blockers, cross sex hormones, surgery, etc. And then when she was in her early 20s, she realized she wasn't any happier. She still had the same psychological issues that she'd had from before, and that it was wrong of the gender clinic to just fast track her into transitioning without ever asking her about any of the underlying psychological issues that she might have. That's just poor medical care. It doesn't matter what your moral or ideological views are. Good medical care would say we need to look at some of the underlying possible psychological issues here. So she took it to court and she won. And in Britain now, you cannot give any of the puberty blockers, cross sex hormones, surgery. You cannot give it to kids 16 and under without a court order. So it's astonishing. She's 23 now. And she must have had good lawyers because a 23-year-old going up against the Supreme Court, it's amazing. It's just amazing that she was able to win this. So they're ahead of us now. But it does give us hope. It does give us hope that people are starting, to some degree, people are starting to turn around on this issue.
And what about and I want to finish this off because I know that time is limited, but with the Equality Act, what are your thoughts on how we go about and deal with that? Because I mean, it's something that we're all dealing with, and I don't think many Christians are still aware of the ramifications that it involves and what it can mean for us should it go through. Although there are some that have been quite vocal and brought attention to it to the point where you're seeing the administration trying to even work with Christians, trying to figure out how to re-articulate the act itself. But what are your thoughts and how we go about dealing with it? First of all, help people understand quickly what it is and why it's so dangerous for us, but how also we should be responding and reacting to it.
Yeah, it's pretty extreme. The Equality Act is very extreme. And I don't have a list at my fingertips right now, but I'll try to remember. Um, no limitations on abortion up to the point of birth. So it gets rid of all abortion, statewide abortion limits, like,
Restrictions.
right, any sort of restrictions on the state level. Totally wipes them out. Totally wipes out any restrictions on, hiring people who, um, might disagree with your mission, like a Christian who doesn't want to hire homosexuals or transgender people. Um, wipes out all protections for Christians. It will affect adoption agencies. Right now, there are adoption agencies who will give children only to two-parent families or only to Christians. Um, it will. Oh yeah, of
It'll
course. When
change the
you
locker room too.
locker, yeah, locker rooms,
Yeah.
schools and locker rooms. Obviously, no restrictions on who can, whether you're a boy or a girl, which locker room you use. It's and there. But here's the most important thing: there are no religious exemptions. Up until now, Christian ministries, churches, schools, universities have had some way of being able to maintain their own integrity, the integrity of their own mission by saying, this is our mission. We have religious right. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to give it a name, has protected Christians from some laws that would otherwise force them to do things that they don't agree with. The Equality Act specifically says you cannot use the religious restoration. Wait, what did I just say? Religious Freedom Restoration Act. You, RFRA. It's called RFRA. Um, because of course RFRA has been used to protect Christian organizations from having to hire homosexual transgender people. And so as a result, they got ahead of us and said, nope, can't use it, cannot use RFRA. So there are no religious exemptions. I don't think Christians have any clue what this is going to mean. All Christian schools, ministries, churches, universities are going to be, open. Uh, what's the word for, free?
Free for all.
What?
Free for all.
Yeah.
Inundated.
Yeah, exactly. And here's the thing you need to know too. First of all, you need to know that it's up against only one vote in the Senate. It's one vote away from being passed. It's already passed the House, the U.S. House, and it is only one vote from passing in the U.S. Senate. Number one. And number two, there's a big push now just for PR purposes of getting it passed in June, because June is Pride Month. And so they would like to accomplish this in June. So it's really under the gun right now. And there are Schumer is trying to get on a voice vote, which it means you walk out on the Senate floor and you just ask for a voice vote. And so there are Christian organizations like Liberty Council that are saying we've got somebody every day on the Senate floor, so that he can't do that. It's that close. And you're right that they're trying to come up with some sort of a compromise, but so that one final vote, they want that one final vote. But yeah, Christians, hey, if you're listening to this right now and it's still June, call your senator, it's in the Senate now. So it's call your senator, write your senator, email your senator, whatever it takes to help them realize that this is not going to go over well with the public, that they will be held accountable. But it's amazing that it got this far. It just shows how far our nation has gone. They have been able to sell it even for people who are more politically conservative, morally conservative, by saying it's just equality. Everyone's for equality.
It's for the language,
the
right?
language.
We're getting it back to
That's
the
the language
who owns
again,
the
isn't
language.
it?
So what are final thoughts? Like one of the segments we like to do right at the end here is here's your water bottle for the week, as people try to water their faith, something that they can sip on to really think about. What's the one thought that you have for our listeners that they can just hold on to and nourish their faith this week?
Take a moment and meditate on verses like offer up your body as a living sacrifice. There are verses that say, you cannot hold on to the stereotype of spirit good, body bad, and then say, offer up your body as a living sacrifice. Why would God want your body? Meditate on verses like that, because that will help you to realize that God cares about your body. I was asked in a recent interview. I was asked in a recent interview in India, by the way. This was an interview, a podcast from India. which was fascinating. And the podcast host asked, Sam Harris, you know Sam Harris, the
Yeah.
well known atheist, Sam Harris says, why do you think, why should Christians think that the God of the universe cares what they do, what people do in their bedroom? Doesn't he have better things to do?
Mm.
The almighty, eternal God of the universe. Why should he care? And I just smiled and said, I'm so glad he cares. God cares about every detail of my life. God cares
Mm.
about all the details of my physical body and what I do with my body. I said, this is not a negative. This is a positive that
Mm.
Christians say. What Christians say that God cares about what you do with your body. In fact, it shows that Sam Harris doesn't care, that his worldview, his secular materialist worldview, does not give him grounds for caring about what we do with our body. It shows that he does not have a worldview sufficient to give dignity and value and significance to what we do with our bodies. So, again, that shows up that the Christian view is much more positive than any secular view. And I'll end with a final story that also came out after Love Thy Body, so it's not in there. Um, there was a woman who passed as a male for 10 years. She transitioned to male and successfully passed as a man for 10 years. And um, then she started visiting a Bible study and became a Christian. But she thought she could still live as a man. She still thought that was fine. And the irony is, here's how she put it. She said, I aspired to be a real man of God. and and then one day when she was praying, she seemed to hear God say to her, you cannot love me and yet reject my creation. And she knew what that meant. She knew it meant you can't reject your body. Your body is part of my creation. You're rejecting your female body, and living as a man. You cannot claim to love me. Is that how I said it? I can't remember.
Mhm.
You cannot claim to love me and yet reject my creation. So I
Mm.
love that as a final word. Is that may God give us the grace not only to love Him but also to love His creation.
Amen and amen. So I would recommend people get the book. It's a great book to have on your bookshelf. It's a great reference to have. It's an encouragement. Like I said before, I love how you structured it. I love how you walked through all of the different issues and how you take kind of a philosophical look of exploring the worldview and then really drawing it out from a biblical perspective on how it's just not coherent, but yet you provide positive examples of people that have been changed and that have been transformed by that. So I would recommend all of our listeners to go out, order the book, Love Thy Body. And how can they follow you so that they can know more about what you are doing?
Well, I am pretty active on Facebook and Twitter and interact with people quite a bit there. I have a website, but it's not as active, but you can go check it out if you'd like, nancypearcey.com, just nancypearcey.com. You can see what my earlier books are. And oh, yeah, I do have a Twitter feed there, so you can keep up to some degree there. But anyway, the best way is just to say hi on Facebook.
All right. Well, Nancy, I want to thank you for coming on Apollos Watered.
Thank you so much for having me. It was delightful talking with you.